Welcome to the American Shoulder and Elbow Surgeons Podcast. I'm your host, Peter Chalmers, a shoulder and elbow surgeon at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Rachel Frank, a sports and shoulder surgeon at the University of Colorado in Denver. Rachel, how are you?
Doing well, Pete. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Before we get started, I should mention that the views expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views of the American Shoulder and Elbow Surgeons Society, the University of Utah, the University of Colorado, or Columbia University. Today, we have the fabulous good fortune to be joined by Dr. William Levine. Many of our listeners will know Dr. Levine, but I'd like to briefly introduce him. Dr. Levine was born and raised in North Dakota. He received his undergraduate degree from Stanford, and then he went to Case Western, where he received his MD, and Tufts, where he was a resident. After fellowships at Columbia and the University of Maryland, he joined the faculty at Columbia, where he's been ever since, serving first as residency director, as fellowship director, and now recently as chair. During his career, he's achieved countless accolades and has published innumerable important papers, culminating most recently in his ASES presidency. Among his greatest achievements is the compassion and enthusiastic mentorship he's provided to thousands of students, myself included. Through this mentorship, he's positively influenced giant swaths of the orthopedic workforce. Dr. Levine, welcome to the podcast.
Peter and Rachel, it's an honor and pleasure for me to be here. Thanks so much. But Peter, I do have to correct one thing. I was actually born in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. And then I crawled across the border when I was 3 months old to Fargo, where I was raised for the rest of my time through high school.
I can't think of a better way to start this podcast than the image of a 3-month-old William Levine crawling across a barren border between Winnipeg and North Dakota to start his life.
There you go.
One of the things that I think is, there you go. That's awesome. Dr. Levine, you exist in a storied lineage at Columbia University. Can you tell us a little bit how it feels for you personally to occupy the same office that was occupied by Dr. Bigliani and then in older times, but relatively recently by Dr. Neer? Does it change the way you approach your job when you arrive at your office in the morning?
Well, I think it's a great question, and it's one of those things where I think you could be overwhelmed by thinking about the footsteps that you're following and the office that you might be taking over. How about Frank Stinchfield, who was kind of called the boss way before Bruce Springsteen was the boss. And Dr. Stinchfield was the chair at Columbia, or what was called New York Orthopedic Hospital, for 20 years from 1956 to 76. So being the 10th chairman of this storied program that was founded in 1866 it's incredible to me to think that that's what I do. And I as I said, I think if you were to take a step back and think about that, I'm not sure that I'd be able to really do my job and work and see patients and do the things I love. So you just kind of put your blinders on and hope that you can one day look back and say, yeah, that was a pretty remarkable opportunity that I was afforded in my personal and professional life. And I hope I did them proud. I think about that all the time. And Dr. Bigliani, of course, is my mentor. And it's an interesting part of mentorship that I talk about with all of my mentees, is that you go through phases. I think we all do, right, Peter? You started as a medical student at PNS, and we had a lot of conversations about your career and where you would end up. And look at how successful you've become through your both your hard work mostly, and then through the support of your mentors. And at some point, you transition from just being mentor-mentee to colleagues, and then I think the ideal situations actually to friends. And so, what happens now is Dr. Bigliani will call me out of the blue and say, congratulations on this recruit, or congratulations on what you're doing with the department, because he's on our email list. So he gets all of my emails that I send to the department. And so he's completely vested in my success and in the department's success. And there's no better sign of leadership than that. Somebody who isn't worried about his successor hopefully carrying on the tradition, maybe elevating the tradition, who knows, but certainly someone who bears zero jealousy, zero adversarial relationships. And as I think you guys both know, that's not the case for all leaders. There are a lot of leaders that get threatened by the next generation. And as I like to tell the young faculty who I've been fortunate enough to recruit at Columbia, if you don't make your division better, the department better, and ultimately surpass your elders, then I may have done a bad job in recruiting you, because that's really what we're looking for. We want people to push us all to be better.
It's really incredible what you've done at Columbia and what you continue to do. Dr. Levine, when we talk about the ASES, what have been some of your proudest accomplishments in your leadership roles there, in particular as president, but throughout all of your roles that you've had within the ASES?
Well, Rachel, it's hard to think about it in those terms. I think it's a little too early as far as my presidency goes, and I'll probably have to have others comment on what they think has been successful or not. I will say that I served for many years as the ASES Fellowship Match Chair, and that was a position that I was really proud of. Ken Yamaguchi, who's Peter's fellowship mentor, and I really worked diligently to make that what was really renowned within all of the AAOS as the premier match. We worked collaboratively, we worked collegially. We introduced a system where the New York fellowships and the Philadelphia fellowships would band together and say, this is crazy to make these residents fly back and forth 6 different times to the 4 New York programs and the 2 Philly programs. So we created an interview grid where the residents would only have to come to New York and Philly for like a 4-day stretch, and they could get all their interviews in. We created a no communication policy so that we eliminated the nonsense that happens after interviews. And that was really Ken Yamaguchi's forethought for doing that. And so I think that was a time where it was kind of the wild, wild west with fellowship interviews. And so I was really proud of the work that we did in getting all of those disparate groups together. Some were private practice, some were academic, and saying, listen, let's set a, you can't talk about role modeling and mentorship and then demonstrate unprofessional behavior. And that's unfortunately what happens, isn't it? We see that with the residency interview process where, people are told they have to come back for a second look. They're told they have to tell you where you're ranking them, which are just blatant violations of all of the rules. And we just thought, hey, we have an opportunity here with the ASES fellowship match to go way above the standard, and let's us be the standard bearers. Let's not ask others. Let's not follow others. So I think that was my first kind of significant role that I played with ASES. I had the honor of being the chair for the meeting when Evan Flato was president. And chairing, the closed meeting at that time was really something that when I was fairly young in my career, and that was a huge honor. And so the ASES to me has just been a phenomenal organization. And of course, serving as the 36th president is certainly the culmination of the highest honor you can achieve in this organization. It's certainly been a challenging year. I said at our State of the Union address that I gave to my department earlier this morning that I believe the word unprecedented has been used about 14 billion times since COVID came onto our radar. But there's probably no better word to use if you're really honest about it, right? I mean, think about how the tentacles of this virus have infiltrated basically every walk of life, every facet that affects us in our daily lives. So to be president of ASES and have one of my first things that I had to do was cancel the specialty day before the academy had even announced they were canceling the meeting was obviously very troubling to me. I mean, so many people put so much work into it, but it wasn't clear what the AAOS was going to do at that point. And obviously they ultimately did cancel, but having to make that decision was certainly a challenge that I hadn't anticipated having to be put into that position. At the same time, the Academy announced the dissolution of all of their relationships, their management service arrangements with the subspecialty societies, which meant that we had to find a new home. We've been at the Academy's home for our entire existence. And so we finally have found a new home in the Chicago area. And so that's taken up a significant amount of time. And then I think the thing that I'm proud of right now is that we were in the midst of this horrific pandemic, and we thought, you know what can we do to help our fellows around the country? Many of them who had to stop operating, stop seeing patients, conferences were shut down. Basically, everything was shut down that we consider kind of holy to our fellowships. And so under the leadership of Ranjan Gupta and Gus Mazzacca, the co-chairs of our education committee, and with Joaquin Sanchez Sotelo, we very quickly put together a 16-week core curriculum for the fellows in ASES. Every Thursday night at 9 p.m., we got a moderator and 2 or 3 faculty. And I can tell you that, how proud was I when we basically came up with this idea, and about 14 minutes later, we had an entire curriculum scheduled. And in the beginning, we had as many as 100 people on some of those early sessions, not only the current fellows, but those who had just matched into fellowships for this year, and other residents and fellowship directors. So I think that just, again, it showed what the ASES is all about, and what our founders would have been really proud of is that, we put aside whatever, differences we might have. We put aside everything else and said, let's come together and do something that's going to be meaningful for our fellows. And so I was really proud of that. And I think it was certainly well received by the fellows.
Dr. Levine, it's funny, you talk and you bring up memories. And I remember receiving an email from you when I matched for fellowship, that all the match emails came from you. Which is, I think, what you just mentioned about cleaning up the match and what an accomplishment that is, and what an important part that is of the beginning of a shoulder surgeon's career. The first thing you do is to say, when we match, we have a collegial way of doing it and a fair way of doing it. That's not going to put people at odds, and not going to put particularly the applicant in an uncomfortable situation. Now, when I matched, there's a story you told me, and I wanted to get on the podcast and confirm. The story, and I'm pretty sure you told it to me, was that at the time when you had first envisioned the match, there was not really a good way to do it. And so that Dr. Cofield's daughter had handwritten the computer program that did the match. And that the reason the match took time was because she had to enter in all of the names and all the lists into her program. Is that true?
Well, there's 2 parts to this story. So the first part of the story is that before we hired Stacy Cofield, so that part is partly true, and I'll go over the rest of that. But before we hired Stacy Cofield, we had, and I won't name any names, but we had a shoulder surgeon who was an ASES member run the match. And he basically, that person would get all of the lists from the fellowships and all of the lists from the applicants. And then he would kind of do what a computer would have done. Remember, there weren't that many fellowships and that many applicants back when we were doing that in the beginning. But unfortunately, we found out retroactively that he didn't quite understand the algorithm and how it was supposed to work. So we quickly said, okay, this can't continue. And so Dr. Cofield said, my daughter is I think she was a computer engineer. I forget exactly what her training was, but she was at the University of Alabama in Birmingham. And I spoke to her one night. We talked about the algorithm that the NRMP uses and how it's weighted towards the resident. In this case, it would be weighted to the student for residency match, and in this case, to the resident for the fellowship match. And so sure enough, Stacy came on board, and we employed her. And she was doing our match up until we went with the San Francisco match, actually.
It's such an incredible story. I mean, to me, it so typifies everything that's great about the society, that that it was essentially family. You know what I mean, from the beginning.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
Now, I want to transition to kind of a similar topic, which is that you've mentored so many students and residents, and certainly you mentioned that you'd mentored me, and you mentored me through a difficult decision, and I think helped me to get out of my own way, which is so often what a mentor is useful for. Many of our listeners are trainees and young surgeons, and think you've given so much good advice over the years. What advice would you give for those in training earlier in their careers about how best to succeed?
Um, Peter, I think that what we all do is we all make mistakes, and the best advice that I try to give people is try not to reinvent the wheel. It's one of my least favorite things to do, and I think we all do it in one way or the other throughout our training. And what I mean by that is when you're going to be a young surgeon in your first job, don't be proud to the point where you are foolish. Don't forsake the elders that you have in your practice or in your department. Don't schedule horrifically difficult cases and think you have to do it all on your own because you're now the guy, the man or the woman who's supposed to be doing all of these difficult cases. I will say that the typical academic paradigm historically has been this scenario: new faculty member, bad OR time, poor assistance, poor anesthesia and nursing care, most difficult cases. Now, if you were going to design a system that would destroy somebody's confidence, that might be it. That might be the perfect system. And I've seen it really, really impinge on people's confidence around the country, from talking to friends and asking to, people calling for advice and so on and so forth. So I think that has historically been what's happened. And I always use, one of my favorite examples is to use the example of Gus Mazzocca and Bob Arciero, two of our incredible ASES members. Bob, past president of AOSSM, Gus, obviously, former chair at UConn, phenomenal surgeons, confident surgeons, technically gifted surgeons. And you know what they do once a month? They schedule their most difficult cases together. At this point, still all these years later, because they know if they have a skilled set of hands as their assistant, that those very difficult cases are going to be that much easier, that your psychological and emotional and spiritual approach to that case is going to be that much easier and better because you're not going to be worried about that case as much because you have that set of hands and that confidant in the operating room. So to me, that is such a incredible symbolic example of no pride whatsoever. Do what's best for the patients. And I think if you try to carry that into your young practice and understand that, what you just did as a fellow bears very little resemblance to what you're going to be doing in practice. The pressure, the intensity, the nerves, the angst, all that stuff is amplified way beyond what anybody can tell you about. And Peter, the last thing I'll give you is it's kind of like before you've had your first child, right? You're about to have your first child, and you can have all the people in the world tell you what it's going to be like to be a parent. You can read all the books you want. You can read you can listen to every podcast. You can do anything you like. But until you have that kid, you have no idea whatsoever what it's really going to be like. And I think that's very analogous to what happens when we all start our first practice.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I definitely did that at first, and I maybe would have done it more because there definitely were cases where halfway through I said, "God, I wish I had someone else to look at this to tell me whether or not it looks okay." And I can't tell you how many times, also early in practice, I would say, "I feel like I've never seen this before," and it made me wonder, "Have I seen this? Did I see this and just not know it?" How have you facilitated that? at Columbia. Tell us how you can what mechanisms, what apparatus can you set up to make that easier, so that you don't have to think to yourself every time, oh, I need to ask for help for this, so that it can become more natural for us to do that as part of our routine.
So ask the question again, Peter. I want to make sure I understand what you're asking me.
I think you're giving great advice for the young surgeon to ask for help. Tell us how we can all incorporate that into our regular routines. How do we make it so that we don't have to rethink every single time we see something difficult? Oh, I should ask for help. Like, I know how I've done that, but I'm curious to know how you've done that at Columbia.
Well, I think that what happens is that there is a transition that happens for every young surgeon. And I will say that it is impossible, frankly, for me to predict. I can hire somebody out of fellowship, and the fellowship director tells me that they're the most confident, capable surgeon they've ever seen, that they could do everything from start to finish without supervision and without much help at all, et cetera, et cetera. And they can get to their first job at Columbia or anywhere else, and they are not that person that I just described. And something about that first transition is very hard for them. And I've seen other young surgeons fresh out of fellowship, who the first week into their practice, they want to take a fellow through a case. They want to take a resident through a case, and they have the utmost comfort level in being able to do so. So I think, first of all, you have to have what I'd like to call situational awareness, which, as you both know, is not something everybody has. In fact, a lot of people have very poor situational awareness. So you have to have EQ and you have to have situational awareness. And that means that you have to be honest enough to say, I know what my strengths are, and I know what my weaknesses are. I know what my opportunities are, and I know what my challenges are. So you can do your own SWOT analysis and figure that all out. And so if you do that first, then I think you have a head start over a lot of people who don't do that. And those are the people who will get into trouble, frankly. And then the second thing is that I think, if you're somebody who is very comfortable to ask for help early on, then what you'll find is that as you do it more and more, and you get your reps in as the primary surgeon, and you get your comfort level, you'll find that the need to have to call the senior partner, you'll stop calling Bob Tajian for every case. You'll call him periodically. You'll stop calling Ken or Lisa or your former mentors. Rachel, you'll stop calling Brian Cole or Tony Romeo. So those mentors are there for you. They're like a security blanket, but you'll find that you don't necessarily need to utilize them as much as you did in the beginning. And you'd rather have that transition be than not use those mentors and not use your senior partners early, and then get yourself into trouble, break down your confidence, and then feel like you're almost desperate for help in the second scenario. And that's really what we want you to avoid having to do.
It's really great advice. And speaking as a surgeon pretty early in my career, I think your pearls and advice resonate quite well. And your description of the first 1 to 2 years in practice, particularly in an academic practice, I think is pretty spot on. Just speaking to your years of experience. Speaking of young surgeons and trainees, and I know you've been pretty active on social media and some podcasts and webinars about this topic, but for our podcast, I think it'd be relevant for our listeners. What are your thoughts on residency and fellowship interviews this year, which is obviously a unique year due to the lack of rotations for aspiring residents, and certainly due to virtual interviews for aspiring residents and fellows alike? What are your thoughts on that? And what advice might you have for our younger listeners who are hoping to get one of those coveted residency spots, or shoulder and elbow fellowship spots, or sports medicine fellowship spots?
Yeah, Rachel, again, due to this unprecedented time we're in, we're dealing with things that we never could have foreseen. I'll start with the residency, because it became very clear, obviously, because we were in New York and we were hit so hard so early, it became very obvious to me that we were not going to be having visiting sub-Is this year. I mean, there was just no question in my mind that that was not going to be happening. And so very early, back in early June, I gathered my program director, Charlie Jobin, who you both know well, our associate program director, Tishan Lynch, who's a phenomenal sports medicine hip and knee surgeon, and then our two chief residents, Carl Herndon and Nana Sarpong, and then a PG3 resident, Nick Danford, and a PG2 resident, Liana Tedesco. And I said to the six of them, here are my thoughts. We're not going to have visiting sub-Is. And so we need to come up with something that is going to be completely different, completely novel, and is going to achieve the goals of letting medical students on their own time, not on our time, learn about our program. We'll learn about them, but we're going to do it in a much longer longitudinal pathway than a typical sub-I experience. My feeling was immediately that the concept of being able to take an in-person sub-I and convert that to a virtual sub-I was really impossible. That was my hypothesis. I just didn't feel like you could do it. And I know some places are trying and they are doing it, and that's fine. And they're certainly not wrong and I'm right. But for me, I just looked at it and I said, I just don't think you can really replicate it. And for a lot of reasons, frankly, one of them being that if you try to do a virtual sub-I, these poor students have to do their home sub-Is, and they can't be pulled thinking they got to be at a 6:30 grand rounds at Utah while they're doing their home sub-I at the University of Colorado, because their home sub-Is this year are the surrogate that we have for what their clinical acumen is going to be, because they're not going to go anywhere else. So I really felt strongly about that. So I said, that part we can't replicate. So we came up with what ultimately evolved was the Columbia Longitudinal Information Program, or CLIP. And CLIP basically did what I just outlined. So we took the students were applied for and screened, just like if they were wanting to come to do a visiting sub-I or to apply for the residency, frankly. And for those that were accepted, they were assigned a resident buddy and a faculty liaison. So that was number one. And then on the students' time, not on our residents' time, not on the faculty time, the students would then coordinate either a Zoom session, a FaceTime chat, a text, email, call, whatever they wanted, and they would start the process of getting to know each other. And that was the first part of it. The second part of it was we then said, okay, let's have twice monthly lectures for the entire group, all of the students and all of our residents. And those will be given by faculty on the least obtrusive time possible. So I picked Sunday at 9 p.m. I figured that's not going to interfere with virtually anybody's sub-Is or anything else. And so that was the next part. And then the third part was on those Sunday nights, twice monthly events, we would then have breakout sessions. And so then the students would get two really important parts of it. Number one, they'd get to see a couple of different residents, because we'd have 3 residents in each of the breakout rooms with 5 to 6 students. And more importantly, or equally importantly, I guess, the students would get to be with other students. And of course, that's what you can't replicate in a virtual sub-I, right? So if you guys were doing your sub-Is at Rush or at HSS or any place, you'd be with 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 other students, some of whom would ultimately be your co-residents or future co-fellows. And so those breakout rooms really became an important part of it. And so we started that back in June, where we have already had 6 of the sessions, the Sunday night sessions. It's been really successful, and the feedback's been phenomenal. And it's giving that longitudinal kind of touch points. So it's not just like you come for a month and you're all in and you do your sub-I, and then you go to your next sub-I and you're all in at the next place, and then you don't really see the student again until interview day. So that was kind of how it was developed, and it's too early to say, but I do think that the feedback has been fantastic. I've had an opportunity to do one-on-one Zoom sessions with every one of the students in the program. So I think that's been great for us to be able to really get to know the students and for them to get to know us. So that's the residency side of things. I think this is the hardest. I mean, it's almost trite to say how horrible this is ultimately for the students applying in ortho this year. It's so challenging for them, and I feel their angst on a daily basis. The lack of mentorship around the country is so palpable. When Ortho Mentor, Tabs Ayer, and Matt Varichello and John Kaplan, the three co-founders of Ortho Mentor, contacted me to participate in Ortho Mentor. Again, I always say, but I think they just needed somebody with gray hair because they were too young. But we talked about things we could do, and when the pandemic hit, we said, let's do some webinars. And we're about to have our sixth webinar next week. But our fourth webinar, we had 5,300 people register and 3,300 people live. We had to like bust out a Zoom and go into YouTube Live because and all that tells you guys is that the dearth of mentorship and the angst about the lack of mentorship out there is just palpable. And so I credit Tabs Ayer and John and Matt for really tapping into something. It's kind of like Ortho Bullets tapped into the dearth of orthopedic fund of knowledge, and ViewMedi tapped into the whole surgical video world. And I think these guys really tapped into the mentorship problem that we have in surgical education.
Well, it's incredible. I mean, it's certainly a different approach this year. It'll be interesting to see how this year's process will influence the process in years to come. You know, I think if we can have sub-Is again and in-person rotations and interviews, it'll be interesting to see how the processes that have been invoked this year might also stand true or work, at least in a combined effort in years to come. As we bring the conversation a little bit back to your career, you know, clearly you've been productive over your career, incredibly productive. You maintain a busy clinical and surgical practice. You complete a high volume of influential research, and you serve in so many administrative and educational roles. And really everyone in the orthopedic community, and in particular the sports medicine shoulder community, you know, knows you and respects you. It's incredible. What have been your strategies to keep ahead of all these responsibilities while also maintaining a life outside work and spending time with your family? How do you do that? And what advice do you have for our listeners?
Well, work-life balance, as you know, is what people talk about, but probably is a faulty term because it presumes that there is a balance in both sides of it. And I don't really think that that's the right way to look at it. Some people have talked about work-life integration as a better way to think about it. And you can argue whether that is different or better. I think that the reality for me is that it's hard. There's no perfect way to do this. You know, as you both know, and you know me well enough, I don't sleep. And so that is a very important part of why I've been able to do a lot of the things I'm able to do. So I only sleep 4 hours a night. And so that does allow me a lot of extra time during the day to get some of the things done that I just can't get done during the earlier parts of the day. And so that's not an advantage that everybody has, but that certainly has been important to me. There's a book that I give to all of my residents and fellows and young faculty. It's by Greg McCown, who's a professor at the business school at Wharton in Philadelphia, and it's called Essentialism. And I can't remember, Peter, if I've ever given it to you, but it's a book that is absolutely should be on your must-read list, and it really helps anybody, but certainly doctors and surgeons who might be listening to this podcast. It helps kind of crystallize the concept of essentialism. And what is essentialism? And what Professor McCown has shown with his research over the years is that you two are great examples of people who have been on the radar for academic success since the second you started your careers. People know who you are because you have been incredibly successful in scholarly productivity, which is what brought you to people's attention. And so then that puts you on a conveyor belt to upward trajectory of success, correct? So that now you're going to get the best residencies, you're going to get the best fellowships, you're going to hopefully get the best jobs. And so what happens though to you is that because you are those people, you then get asked to do more things. You get asked to co-host the ASES podcast. And why do you get asked to do that? Because you guys not only have shown success, but you are closers. And closers are like Mariano Rivera, right? You're in the ninth inning. Who do you want out there? You want Mariano, you want Mo, because you guys get the jobs done. And you don't only just get the jobs done, but you get them done extraordinarily well. So that then begets more asks. So now it's like a Ponzi scheme. We know that Rachel will get it done. We're going to ask Rachel to do it. We know Peter will get it done. We're going to ask Peter to do it. And that just continues to snowball. And in the first 5 years of your life, in the first 5 years of your professional career, it's really important to say yes to almost all of those asks. Those asks might be see one more patient, do one more surgery, take one more call, come to the ER to see this fracture dislocation. Can you help me with this paper? Can you help me with this podcast? Can you help me? Can you? And the 3 A's that we always talk about, right, are ability, affability, and availability. But in the first 5 years, availability trumps all others. Because if you start saying no in the first 5 years, that can be a huge stumbling block. So what Greg McCown would say is that essentialism is to say in the first 5 years of your career, regardless of the profession, you say yes, because that's going to help you get successful. And that's what you guys have done. And that's why you are where you are. Years 6 through 10 of your career, you need to start saying no. And you start to say no to things that are not essential. And this is where you then start to have to be analytical about what is your mission? What are your goals? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? And if you can identify and articulate your mission, you can now say, okay, I'm going to throw out the non-essential stuff. Now, what is our fear for you two and for others like you, so many out there listening who are successful? Your fear is that if you say no, it will thwart your upward trajectory. It will thwart your pathway to success. That's your fear. But what the research shows and what reality shows is just the opposite happens. When you start to discard the stuff that's non-essential, you become more good, if you will, at the essential stuff because you're not feeling too diluted. And the stuff that you thought, oh my God, if I say no to, someone else is going to do it. And it's not going to impact you at all. And then, of course, as you get even further into your career, you start saying no to a lot more things because now you can be much more selective and say, you know what, unless it's something that's really either a passion of mine or really important to me, I really don't have to do that anymore because you're established in your career, you're established in your profession, and you can let other people do it. The last part that is critical is the family part. And so how do you manage that? Well, I had the good fortune of doing an ICL at the Academy every year on lifelong learning, and with Jack Flynn, who is one of my good friends, who's the chief of pediatric orthopedics at CHOP. And Jack gives a phenomenal talk on work-life integration / work-life balance. And one of the things I learned from that Jack's talk is that the first thing you do when you're a parent is that you get your kids' schedule for the year, at least for the next 6 months. And you get that schedule, and then you say to your office coordinator, here's Claire's tennis schedule, my 15-year-old daughter, when she got to play tennis last fall, but won't get to play this fall because of the pandemic. I said, here's Claire's tennis schedule. Make sure that I am booked out for everything on every one of her events. And here's Claire's basketball schedule. And book me out for every single event. And here's Jill, my wife's schedule, and make sure that I'm booked out for whatever events that we need to be at together. And it's a surefire way to say to yourself, nothing is more important than those events that you identify as being important. And it may be a recital, it may be a sports event, it doesn't matter. But what you realize, of course, is that you can't do that a week in advance. You can't do that 3 days in advance when you've got a office filled with 45 patients. But you can do anything 3 months in advance. And so when people complain, oh, I missed my kids this, or I missed my husband's this, or I missed my wife's that, there's nobody to blame other than yourself. You didn't have to be in the office. You didn't have to go to that meeting. You didn't have to do that OR case. You could have scheduled around it. So that's really probably been the most important thing I think I've learned over the years. And I certainly am not a role model for that. I've made plenty of mistakes, but I think I've done my best in the last few years to really try to make that part of how I've tried to honor my family and also do the things I need to do professionally.
One of the questions I want to ask you as a follow-up from that, and I think that's you've given such an incredible block of good advice over the whole podcast, but that in particular, the advice about essentialism, you've told me that, and I certainly I've gotten similar advice from Dr. Yamaguchi. One of the things that you mentioned in there is that you need to have a mission. And one of the questions I've often wondered is, when is the appropriate time to begin the process of deciding what your mission is? The reason I ask that question is because you obviously, while you're in training, you are beholden to someone else's mission. You are beholden to the mission of the program, or the priorities of your mentors. And then when you're out in practice, all of a sudden you are, as you mentioned, have control over your own schedule. But I often wonder if at the very beginning you really know what would be the most important thing to you. So what is your recommendation? Should people do that as a fellow, sit down, write down what their mission is? Should you wait a year or two in practice before you have that conversation with yourself? What do you think is there an optimum time at which someone should say to themselves, now is the time when I'm going to really decide what I want to accomplish?
Well, I think that it's probably one of the most important things that we can do, and it's probably one of the things that's done the least in my experience. I mentioned Tyshawn Lynch earlier. I always have to give him credit for this. When Tyshawn was early in his practice, and he would come for his end of the year evaluation with me, which I sit down with our faculty and talk about the year that's passed and then the year coming forward and what your goals are. To some extent, what is your mission, quote unquote. And Tyshawn would come in with a 3-ring binder. And it would include everything that he had done in the year. It would include what his 5-year plan was. And then he holds himself accountable to the things that he would like to achieve. And I think you guys both know this and appreciate it, but your listeners know, I'm sure as well. If you're a fellow in our fellowship program and you have to present at every weekly research meeting for our shoulder and elbow service, if you have to present every week, even if you haven't done anything from the last week to this week, you are holding yourself accountable. If you never present, it's much easier to kind of let 1 week turn into 1 month, turn into 6 months, turn into, oh my God, I really didn't do the things I'd hoped to do in this year. You guys both resonate with that concept?
I couldn't agree more that for us, having a regular meeting in which you have to stand up and say, this is what I'm doing, that public event is enough often to compel you to do something.
Totally. So if you both agree with that, then think about, I sit down with our 6 interns back in June when they showed up, and Illyrio Demeriles comes to us from the University of Michigan. And I thought I was like in a time warp because I thought it was Tyshawn Lynch all over again. He's an intern and he comes in with a 3-ring binder because he knew we were meeting to talk about his goals and objectives for the year. And he has his 5-year plan outlined. I was like blown away. But the point is that having that kind of 5 year, and 5 years are good increments for us as physicians, because 5 years is residency. And then once you're done with fellowship, the first 5 years of your practice, as we've been talking about, that's really when you're going to become mature in most situations. Yeah, you can find some jobs where you're going to be doing 400 cases in your first 2 years, but that's not the reality for most of us. And most people, it's going to take 5 years to get your maturation as a surgeon. So the first 5 years, what are your goals? Years 6 to 10, what are your goals? Do you want to be a residency director? Do you want to be a fellowship director? Do you want to be a team physician? Do you want to have upward trajectory in ASES? Do you want to have upward trajectory in AOSSM? Do you want to be doing hospital leadership? Do you envision yourself being a dean one day? Where do you see? Do you just want to be a great shoulder and elbow surgeon, have a wonderful family, and that's all you want? There's nothing wrong with that, but you have to be honest with whatever of those pathways you are. You have to be honest about what it is you'd like to achieve, because it's not going to happen by chance. It's going to happen because you give yourself the opportunities to achieve that pathway and to fulfill your mission. And so the problem is that if you don't articulate those goals and objectives and identify your mission, then you can obviously appreciate how easy it is to have mission creep and to start saying yes to things that really do take you off the path, and then lead you to kind of saying, well, why am I doing this? Because this isn't really what I want. So I think for the best advice for all of us is be honest. What do you want? And then set up a pathway by which you put yourself in position to ultimately achieve those goals.
Well, we could probably go on for another hour or more talking about this. And I know this whole conversation, this whole, podcast really resonates with Pete and myself. And I'm sure so many of the listeners, both young, mid-career and end career, so many pearls here. We really only have time for one more question, just due to the nature of the podcast and the limits that we have. So Dr. Levine, if you could have dinner with any person from history, who would that person be, and where in New York City would you eat?
Oh my goodness gracious. Any person in history. Wow.
And present parties excluded. It can't be Pete or myself.
Yeah, I'd love to take you guys both to 11 Madison, but it's closed. Okay, let me think about this for a second. I can have dinner with anybody in history. Well, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to approach that. But I think, because we're talking about the American shoulder and elbow surgeons, I would like to sit down with Codman. I would love to have had dinner with Codman. And the reason I say that is that he was such a rebel. He was an outcast. I'm sure you guys know the history of how he was thrown out of the Orthopedic Society because of his renegade views. But he was such a savant in a way, right? He was talking about outcomes, at a time where nobody had even heard that word. And he was talking about how we had to follow our patients and understand what we were doing as surgeons only about 100 years before we had registries. And embarrassingly, we still don't have registries at the majority of medical centers around the world. So just from a pure shoulder and elbow perspective, I think that would be the person I would say would be amazing to try to understand how he came up with his ideas, and all his book is obviously the classic. We give it to our fellows as they graduate every year. And thanks to John Ticker, it's now available again. And I hope everybody, if you don't have it, please go through the ASES website and you can order it. And it's a great donation to the ASES Foundation. So I hope that's not too corny, but it's actually somebody that I think has had such an impact on what we do, not just in shoulder and elbow surgery, but in medicine.
Right.
And Rachel, the only thing I didn't tell you is where I would take Dr. Codman for dinner. And there's so many great options in New York pre-pandemic, but we'd have to narrow it down a little bit. Do we want the best slice of pizza? Do we want the best 5-course meal? Do we want a 10-course tasting menu? So too many choices in New York City. A little bit more. Denver's got a pretty good food town though, right?
It's decent. It's not a New York, it's not a Chicago, but it's growing for sure.
Well, Dr. Levine, thank you for so much for spending an hour with us. I know that our listeners will find this so valuable, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate all of the pearls you've shared with us, and certainly I will thank you personally for the mentorship you've provided to me over the years, and I can't tell you how important it's been to me. So for all of us, really thank you.
Well, Peter and Rachel, thanks so much on behalf of ASES. It truly has been an honor for me to be the president this year. We're looking forward to our annual meeting on October 2nd and 3rd, the first ever virtual meeting. Lisa Gallitz and Charlie Jobin, our co-chairs, have put together a phenomenal domestic and international faculty, both Friday night and Saturday morning. We've got great relive surgeries and symposia and ICLs. Louis Biliani, my mentor and friend, will be the near lecturer, and General Stan McChrystal will be the Codman lecturer. I'm really looking forward to a great meeting. So thanks so much. It's been a lot of fun, and I'm so proud of both of you and all of the accomplishments that you both had, and seeing you guys both kind of rise through the ranks already in your young careers. There's nothing that makes me prouder, and it's one of the exciting things about mentorship is even people that you might not necessarily personally mentor, but have opportunities to interact with in our careers. One of the nicest things about academics is that opportunity. Rachel, you know, I remember vividly sitting down with you at the academy when you were trying to decide about your job search, and having those opportunities to interact with young people and listen to what their dreams are and their thoughts are, and see where you guys are now. It's really gratifying to see how well you've both done.
Well, thank you so much. I remember that conversation very vividly myself, and you have a way of articulating exactly what I think many of us, at least I can say personally, I know I'm thinking, and it just speaks to your ability to understand what we're going through and to personalize it. And I know Pete and I both really appreciate that. And hopefully all our listeners are looking forward to the annual meeting. I know we are. And at this point, that's really all the time we have for this podcast. We really want to extend our gratitude to our guest, Dr. Levine. We hope that you, Dr. Levine, and your family are staying safe in New York, and all of our listeners are staying safe and healthy. For all of our shoulder and elbow listeners out there, please don't forget to subscribe. And for Pete Chalmers, I'm Rachel Frank, and we'll see you next time.